Hello, my name is Wes Thompson. I'm a principal investigator at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research. And today I'm going to give a talk about longitudinal analyses of the ABCD data. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So, so again, I'm going to talk about longitudinal analyses of the ABCD study. I'm going to actually um, do this talk in four parts. So the first part is on longitudinal analyses. So the adolescent brain cognitive development study is the largest long-term study of child brain development in the U.S., starting in 2016. The study enrolled a cohort of almost 12,000 children who were ages 9 and 10 at baseline and are being tracked for at least 10 years with annual assessments in 21 sites across the U.S. I'm sure this is all information that you know, but the relevant fact for this talk is that this is longitudinal data, annual assessments for lots of measures, every other year for brain imaging, but many measures that have been taken repeatedly on the same individuals over time across the years. So this has resulted in a very rich multimodal data set, including cognitive tests, mental and physical health, substance use, environment, neuroimaging, genetics, and so forth. Uh, and it's a very diverse sample. It was intended to roughly reflect the U.S. population diversity in terms of sex, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic factors. And so the intent was to make it a more broadly generalizable study so that the results that are discovered in the data pertain to the country as a whole as much as possible. So the four parts of this lecture are going to be longitudinal modeling strategies. So how to analyze developmental change over multiple time points in the ABCD data. Then how to handle missing data. So I'll cover several approaches to maximize data use and reduce bias from dropout or non-response. Also cover internal validity and confounding. Internal validity is basically are the results, the associations that you find causal, and so it's observational data, and so the answer is we never really know, but there are design features and analytic methods that have been created to strengthen causal inference in observational data. And then finally, interpreting effect sizes, so making sense of statistically significant results in a very large sample where it's often the case that associations that would traditionally be considered quite small are very highly significant when you have 12,000 people that you're analyzing. So I'm going to break this talk up into these four topics. And the first topic I'm going to cover is longitudinal modeling strategies. Okay, so key longitudinal research questions. So what factors predict individual differences in developmental trajectories? For example, who shows faster or slower cognitive growth? Who plateaus or keeps rising? Who shows deviations from normal trajectories, so on and so forth. How did the timing and duration of exposures, for example, the onset or persistence of substance use, impact later developmental outcomes, for example, on brain development or on mental health or neurocognition? And then how are changes in different domains interrelated over time? So brain, behavior, environment. Key questions in this last thing, the interrelated um, associations among different trajectories, is mediation analysis, which I'll cover in a little bit more detail, and also bidirectional effects, where you have like processes which impact each other over time. And so both of these are kind of key developmental questions that arise from data sets, longitudinal data sets. So, first of all, longitudinal data is defined as data that has been collected at multiple time points within person. That could be as few as two time points, and traditionally, two time points was relatively common, where you had like pre-post designs. But these designs can be very limiting. Like different scores or ANCOVAs can give contradictory results if groups differ at baseline. It's impossible to assess more than a linear change if you only have two time points. Three or more waves allow for modeling nonlinear change in individual trajectories. ABCD already has more than three annual waves for many measures, including brain imaging there's four time points on the 6.0 release for at least half the sample. And so this enables more robust longitudinal modeling and more flexible longitudinal modeling. There's a lot more different types of longitudinal models that you can apply when you have more than two time points and when you have three or four or even more time points. So the recommendation then is to leverage modern longitudinal methods that use all available time points for greater power and to capture developmental trends more reliably and also more flexibly with fewer assumptions and like assumptions about linearity and so forth. And before I go on, I want to just note that this portion of the talk is based on a longitudinal paper that the biostatistics work group published not too long ago. In all the citations for the work that I'm quoting in this talk are given at the end of the slides, and so I'll make sure that those are distributed to you guys. So traditional versus modern approaches. Traditional longitudinal analyses focus on mean change and often treat each person the same. So, like for example, repeated measures ANOVA and difference scores. These are very straightforward, but may fail to model individual variability and require strong assumptions like no baseline differences or parallel trajectories or linear trajectories. And so the traditional approaches, while still applicable in many instances and useful, are limited in what they can do and the assumptions that they make. So more modern approaches emphasize within-person trajectories and between-person differences in trajectories. These include mixed effects models and other techniques that better handle complex longitudinal data. And we can group these models into broad categories. So we have the traditional models that were predated more intensive longitudinal data collection. Then we have modern extensions and GLM extensions. We have structural equation models, and then we had advanced hybrid models. And these different modeling approaches are covered in more detail in the ABCD longitudinal paper that I mentioned that was published at DCN recently. So modern GLM methods. So there's a number of different techniques that have been developed to analyze longitudinal data in the past like 20, 30 years. So one of them is called generalized estimating equations. This is an extension to generalized linear models that allows for handling the within person correlation caused by collecting the data on the same person across different time points. The GEs treat this as kind of a nuisance characteristic that you have to deal with to get appropriate inferences, appropriate standard errors on your coefficient estimates. But it is a very useful technique, and it's very computationally fast and converges in cases that other methods, that more complex methods, more likelihood-based methods sometimes don't. And so GEs can actually be very useful. They have been applied to the ABCD data in some published instances. Um, but the more common approach that has been used, the probably the most common approach that's been used is linear mixed effects models or LMMs. These are called a number of different things in literature, like multi-level models. There's other like different disciplines have called them different things, but I'm going to call them linear mixed effects models. And that's where you have fixed effects and you have random effects. And the random effects typically are just sources of nesting structure in the data that causes correlation among measures. So sources of nesting in ABCD are within person over time. That's the longitudinal data. Within families, because there's several thousand siblings in ABCD data, and that causes a nesting structure. And then also within site. And so often mixed effects models employed on ABCD data have three levels of nesting. So within person over time, within family, and within site. Site you could actually model either use it as a fixed effect or a random effect. I haven't seen that make terribly much difference doing it one way or the other. But in any case, you can treat that as a random effect and include that as a random effect in your mixed effects model. And then you have generalized linear mixed models, and these are basically LMMs that extend the linearity assumption to other data types like binary, like logistic regression and Poisson regression and so forth. So there's basically random effect, mixed effects models that handle the different data types that aren't necessarily linear or continuous. Um, there's also other methods that include autoregressive components, for example, autoregressive cross-leg panel models. These models include an autoregressive and cross-lagged component, so autoregressive components within measures and then cross-lagged reciprocal influence paths between variables across waves. And this is useful for exploring bidirectional effects. For example, like behaviors might have some impact on the brain, but of course the brain might have some impact on future behaviors and so on and so forth. And so when you have longitudinal data, you can explore questions of like lagged relationships among pairs or larger sets of variables. The traditional autoregressive cross-leg panel models confound within person change with between person differences, unless you incorporate modifications. And so you should be cautious about those using these models in ABCD. I'll talk about another example, random intercept cross-legged panel models in a upcoming slide. But in summary, overall, modern GLM methods better accommodate individual differences, time-varying covariates, and complex outcome distributions, and they typically outperform older methods in flexibility, albeit with more complexity. So, so here's an example of a mixed flex model. This is something that you might want to apply to the ABC data where you have fixed intercept beta 0, fixed slope beta 1. So if Yij is the some response, say brain imaging or neurocognitive or mental health or health variable on subject I at time j. And so you have basically a fixed effects of a fixed linear component that's the same across everybody. But then you have subject-specific components, the U0i and U1i, which basically allow the line to vary the intercept and the slope to vary by person. So each person has their own individualized linear effect. And then you can have other levels of nesting, like I said, like within family or within site. And you can have other fixed effects covariates and so on and so forth. So the key assumption and the key typical assumption in the random effects models or the mixed effects models is that these U0i, U1i, the random effects, the random intercept, the random slope come from a normal bivariate normal distribution. And so that makes it a very computationally efficient way to model the data because there's really only two parameters. There's only a few parameters you're estimating based on because of the normality assumption. There's also other approaches that incorporate structural equation modeling. So structural equation models are a way to model complex to basically model complex structures in your models. So like complex causal structures or multiple lots of different variables at the same time. And so like a very common one is called the latent growth curve model, and this basically is an extension for LMMs that allows for adding predictors of growth factors or outcomes, and so allows for kind of more complex structures in the LMMs. There's also the cross-leg panel models or the random intercept cross-leg panel models. And that also allows for bivariate relationships, cross-legged relationships, but it includes a random intercept per person. And so that is better able to differentiate within person and between person effects compared to models that don't include the random intercept. And the nice thing about these random intercept cross-diag panel models is that they require typically 4 time points to be identifiable with no assumptions or with minimal assumptions. And so and that it is currently the case that several key variables, including the imaging variables in ABCD, have 4 time points or more. And so these are very applicable to the ABCD data in the 6.0 data release. There's a number of other different models. I'm not going to get into too much detail, and again, I'm gonna refer you to the publication that is at the end of these slides. The ABCD longitudinal paper that was just published a few months ago in DCN. So there's methods that have been developed for intensive longitudinal data. This is probably not so applicable to ABCD, with the exception of perhaps if you're looking at the time series data from the imaging, or if you're looking at the Fitbit data. But there's a number of interesting approaches that have been developed for like very intensely sampled longitudinal data. There's person-centered trajectories, so there's like growth mixture models that allow for latent groups in the data to have different shapes of trajectories. Like it could be like different slopes or even like different nonlinear shapes. There's also like a class of models called functional data analysis that allows for like non-parametric curve estimation that allows for even more variation across people in terms of the shapes of the trajectories with minimal assumptions. Um, it, ABCD is still maybe a little bit too sparse. I mean, it's not quite enough time points yet for the functional data analysis to be that useful. But I envision that like within like the next couple of data releases, those methods might also be very applicable and interesting to apply to the data. And then there's hybrid approaches like time varying effect models, unified SEM that combine multi-level and time series modeling to capture complex dynamics. I think like they definitely have their place, and depending on what you're doing with the data, you might delve into those. But I think like for like this would probably be more specialized applications or more kind of niche applications or expert applications of the data. I think typically like the mixed effects models, the linear mixed effects models or the GLMs would be the more typically applied to the data. And then finally, I just want to talk a little bit about mediation in longitudinal data because I think this is a very crucial topic that I've seen lots of people interested in applying it to. In typical, like a very typical situation for mediation, longitudinal mediation in ABCD is with the brain imaging data. So you may have some exposure, it could be time invariant or time varying exposure. And then you have some behavioral outcome, it could be mental health or neurocognition or something. And then you want to see if the impact of the exposure on the behavioral outcome is mediated by its impact on the brain, either brain structure or function. And so you have potentially a longitudinal exposure, you have a longitudinal brain imaging measure, and then you have a longitudinal outcome. And you have the mediation model that says like the exposure's impact on the behavior is mediated by its impact on the brain. So that's I think a very common way to think about analyzing the data and to use the brain imaging data in ABCD. And so the basic idea of mediation is that you have the exposure X, the outcome Y, and you can decompose the impact of the exposure X on Y into direct and indirect pathways via the mediator M. So the classic decomposition is that the total effect C is equal to C prime plus A times B, where C prime is the direct effect and A times B, A is the effect of X on M, and B is the effect of M on Y. And so the total effect is just the sum of the two, the direct and the indirect effects. So in longitudinal data, the temporal sequencing supports causal interpretation, potentially if you have the exposure that happens before the mediator, which then happens before the outcome. Though you have to be careful about whether or not the measurements just happen in those temporal ordering, or if the actual things themselves happen in the temporal ordering. So you have to be careful about the temporal ordering part. So just because the data they're temporally ordering your data doesn't mean that in real life there was a that temporal ordering was obeyed in actuality. So, but the longitudinal data does potentially allow you to look at this like temporal ordering of the impact of the exposure on the mediator and then the mediator on the outcome. Oh, this got a little garbled here. Sorry. So I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but you can model the indirect effects. The mediator at time t is a function of the exposure at time t minus one, plus some impact of the mediator itself at time t minus one, and then the outcome at time t you can model via prior levels of the exposure, and then the prior levels of the outcome and the mediator. But this is one way of decomposing it. There's a lot of different ways you can decompose it. Some of this has to be guided the scientific hypotheses, and part of it's just going to be guided by when the data were actually collected in ABCD, and there's some variation in that across the different measures over time. In ABCD applications, the mediation models have been applied to, say, brain morphometry or connectivity, mediating environmental or genetic exposures on outcomes. So practical considerations and challenges. The longitudinal mediation often requires at least three time points to at least to address the correct temporal ordering. There's also issues with time varying confounding, potential missing data or data that aren't collected on the same time points, and then measurement invariance across time for valid mediation. And so, like essentially the variables have to be capturing the same construct over time, and that's not necessarily guaranteed. And the key assumption for the mediation analysis to be causal is no unmeasured confounders. So in that you've included the confounders correctly in your model, and that you've got the correct lag structure and the correct model specification. There's a number of different ways of conducting sensitivity analyses to check these assumptions, and the key packages to use. If you're doing structural equation models, you can use Lavon, or you can use M+. If you're doing Bayesian models, you can use Stan. There's also a mediation package that implements causal mediation analysis, and that can also be quite useful. And it's probably the simplest one of these things to apply. So I should have put that down here. And there's Tyler Van der Weel is the key person to reference for mediation models and longitudinal mediation models. He has many papers on this topic that covers the different modeling approaches and the assumptions necessary for these to be causal. Okay, I'm gonna stop here, and I will cover the other three topics in other recordings. Okay, thank you.